Hey everybody, welcome back. Alright, so in this lesson we're going to be making the pad sound in a free synth called Vital. You can get Vital just by googling Vital VST and it will be the first link that you see. And if you scroll down, eventually you'll get to the different versions that you can get. Now you can get the full version, which is completely free. And if you want to pay, then you can get some more presets, but that's the only difference. Plus you get to support the developer. But in my opinion, this synth is pretty much as good as, and in some ways better than, a synth called Serum by Xfer, which is another wavetable based synth. So just select the version you want, and you can download the version for your particular operating system. Once it's downloaded, just install it. Now, I'm not going to go into where to install it as it can be different for every DAW, but that is info that's easy to find with a quick Google. Alright, so in your DAW, I would start with a blank project or your preferred blank template of choice. And right away, we're going to load up Vital. So for me, it's easy. I'll just load an instrument track, load up Vital. And the first thing I'm going to do is just make this a little bit smaller so it fits on the screen properly. So you can change the size of it by clicking the little V up the top there. I'm just going to go to 70%. Because 100% is just a little bit too big. That's absolutely fine. And now in my DAW, the first thing I'm going to do is just turn this down. This is like the quick cheat way of gain staging your project so that when you start adding loads of other elements to your track, it does not get too loud. So turn it down to somewhere around about -11. That's absolutely fine. So the next thing I want to do is bring in a MIDI file from the work files. So if you brought the tutorial, you can load it from the work files folder, go to MIDI files and then load in the full pad MIDI. Just drag that onto the Vital instrument. It should just load up in there. If you're watching this on YouTube, there is a link in the description to download the free MIDI file, which is the first 4 bars of the progression. So just download it, open it up, and then of course you can just drag that into your arrangement. However you've done it, just make sure that your MIDI is starting from bar 5. So if you do it on bar 5 like I am, then everything will line up in your project. So you'll know when I talk about being on bar 11 or 12 or whatever, you'll know that we're in the same place. So I'm just going to loop the first 4 bars of this progression. And if you've downloaded the free version from YouTube, that's what you'll get, just the first 4 bars. Now, just so you know, if I go into it, I'll just show you roughly what this chord progression looks like. So it is actually quite complex. It's like a 32-bar chord progression. Although, of course, you know, the main part of it repeats, but that's fine. So just so you know, in the coming lessons, we'll actually go over this step by step, how to make this progression, and we'll cover all of the knowledge required to be able to make your own epic chord progressions. Not just this progression, but really any progression that you want to be able to make. But for now, I just wanted to bring this MIDI in so we've actually got enough that we can start sculpting our pad in Vital. Because obviously at the moment it sounds very unpad-like. So let's go into Vital and get started. If you're new to this, it can look a little daunting, but no worries. We're going to be doing sort of entry-level sound design in this tutorial. And first, let me briefly, and I do mean briefly, explain the basics of how the synth works. Also, just so you know, if you did buy the actual course, all these patches are available in the work files. So if you do get really stuck, you can just load them up. And there are instructions on how to do that in the same folder as the presets. So the most fundamental thing to understand in any synthesizer is really the signal path of the sound. So where it starts from and where it is going before it comes out of the synth into your DAW. So in any synth really, it all starts with the oscillator section. This is where the sound is produced and where you sort of create the initial timbre of the sound. Timbre meaning the sort of texture of the sound. You can change the timbre by using sort of various different waveforms, which you can cycle through. You can add more oscillators to it. There's 3 main oscillators in Vital, plus you've got like a sample oscillator as well. And after you've created the initial sort of texture of the sound, the signal then goes through to what we refer to as the subtractive part of the synthesizer. So here we can shape the dynamics of it by changing the envelope. So this is the envelope over here. This controls the dynamics of the amplitude. So if I add, say, an attack to it, you'll hear that we get a slow lead into the sound. for example, and then we can send it off through a filter as well. So if I activate the filter, and I'll just turn off oscillator 2 and 3 for now. So that's sort of like sculpting the sound. And there are also endless ways to modify and modulate the sound that you have made. And we'll look at the sort of basics of that throughout the tutorial. Then you have the effects page where you can add anything really, chorus, compressor, delay, distortion, all sorts of stuff to the sound extra to further sort of sculpt the sound to how you want it to be. But that's enough of an overview. Short though it was, it's really enough right now just to understand where the sound starts and sort of how it progresses through the synth. It's not much good talking about what each of the functions do when you don't really have a framework for how that works. So to sort of help with that, let's actually start making the sound. Just so you know, if you sort of made loads of tweaks and you want to go back to the initial preset, which is how Vital loads when it first loads up, just click on the 3 lines here and go to initialize preset, and this just resets everything in Vital. So again, let's start with the oscillator section. Now it's actually already on the right waveform. This is like a saw wave, and that's a good starting point. But what I want to show you is this control over here, Unison. So for now, I'm just going to turn this down. So this is the Unison Detune. We'll bring this back up in a sec, but it's better to start with it down. So what I'm going to do is start adding more voices for it. So you just click and drag up on this to add more voices. You can hear it sort of changing the sound a bit, but what does that really mean? So adding more voices basically means you're adding more oscillators playing the same saw wave. So instead of just one oscillator, which would be if I have it on one voice, I've got like 16 voices all playing the same saw wave. Now, that doesn't sound that impressive when I play it until you start actually messing with the detune dial. So I'm just going to play it and I'll mess with this and you'll hear what I mean. And you can hear straight away it really sort of thickens it up into this nice, almost like trancey kind of lead, but it really sort of just fattens it up and makes it much more interesting. Okay, so that's fine. Now let's add another oscillator to it. So we're going to activate oscillator 2. Now this one, it's not really doing much if I just play it. It's just adding one more voice really to the initial oscillator 1. So what I'm going to do is actually pitch this down. So I'm just going to click where it says pitch and drag this down. So -12 will be down 1 octave. I'm just going to play that. Okay, nice. Just really thickens it up having an oscillator playing 1 octave down. That's great. So next thing, let's move on to actually sculpting the sound a bit. Oh, actually, first of all as well, I want to change the second oscillator so it's also going through filter 1 rather than filter 2. You can see here that oscillator 1's already being routed through filter 1 as well. So with the sort of texture of the sound, sort of how I want it, or at least roughly in the right place, I'm going to come over and start sort of sculpting the sound using the envelope. So envelope 1 is for the amplitude dynamics. So that means basically volume wise, it will shape it as I showed before. So if we add more of an attack, a little bit more pad like, but we don't need to be that extreme. We're going to do something else. I just want a little bit of attack on that. So it's just got that slight sucky feeling going into the very first sort of half a second of the sound. That's fine for now. Let's turn up the release a bit as well because we want it to have a bit of a tail so all the chords blend into each other. So you can hear when I stop it, you can hear it tail off. That's the release of the sound. So, okay, great. That's starting to sound a little bit nicer, no problem. But now we want to add a filter. So I'm going to activate filter 1. Let me just play that. You can change the cutoff of the filter by using this slider. And you can hear it's got that kind of resonant feeling to it. That's because the resonance at the moment is like halfway up. This is how you change the resonance of the filter. So obviously you can turn the resonance right off. Well, we'll stick to having it about halfway up. It's quite nice. Makes it a bit more interesting, the sound. But rather than just filter it, what I want to do is actually modulate this filter so it sort of sucks into the sound. So to do that, we need to add an attack, just like with the attack on the amplitude. Obviously, if we turn that up, it sort of gives it that slow, gentle lead in to the sound. So we want to do this, but with the filter. So it's really easy to do. We're going to use envelope 2 for this. So let's just click envelope 2. And also where you see these like little grayed out 4 arrows with a dot in the middle, we're actually going to click that and drag it over. So when we get that little circle there, we know that this is going to affect the filter cutoff. So if I drop that, and now not much is going to happen if I play it, because we haven't actually done any affecting to the envelope. So if I now raise up the attack, you can actually start to see the filter itself being modulated by this envelope here. So we can sort of turn this down. So we're starting to get there. It's not quite right. It doesn't really sound how I want it to at the moment. So we're just going to get these settings a bit more accurate. So I'm just changing the hold so that every time the pad plays, we get a full sort of cycle. So it's not too bad, but we need to make a few changes to this yet. So we're going to grab this little control point in the middle and just move it up so we get more of a kind of quick raise in the cutoff, and then it sort of gets more gentle towards the end. And you can see it playing out. Also, we need to move the attack up as well, or raise that up, so it's more in line with envelope 1, which is doing the amplitude. Don't worry too much if this isn't sort of like super sinking in right now. The more we do it, the more you'll start to understand the process. This is just the first time we're doing it, so don't worry too much if it's not all sort of making perfect sense yet. So we got to just make another modification. So when I play it, it's a little bit too extreme. So what we want to do is sort of turn down the effectiveness of the filter. It's like changing the mix of it, really, of how much this envelope affects the filter. And we do that by actually clicking on this tiny little dot here. And if you click and drag up and down, you can actually see how much we're going to be affecting the filter by. So if we have that circle completely filled, then it's like maximum effectiveness or full mix. And if we turn that right down, then it won't affect it as much. So it's much more sort of gentle. So we want it a little bit higher than that, but not too much, somewhere around here. And of course, as it's playing, we can and we will also automate this, the filter cutoff. And for the standard settings, we are basically there. I did say it was going to be a very simple patch, and it's really easy to get something that sounds nice and luscious. Now, obviously, when we start sort of getting into how the chord structure was made, then it's really going to start sort of taking shape as we add all the bass notes in and everything. But for now, that's absolutely fine. Now, there's one thing more that I want to do, and that is just this velocity track dial down here. So this is really quite important. Let me just close Vital for a second and I'll go into the MIDI. Now, as you can see here, we've got these like different colored notes. So I'm not sure about your DAW, but in Cubase, basically the brighter red color it is, the higher the velocity, and the sort of darker the color, more purple, the lower the velocity. And having a variation in velocity throughout the performance is like really important in getting an emotional feel to your melody. Just so you know, the velocity is like how hard or how soft a real instrument like a keyboard is struck. So if I hit a key really hard on a keyboard, that's like high velocity. If I press it very gently, that's got very low velocity. With synths like Vital, the stock setting is basically to ignore the velocity information. So it's set on 0 at the moment. So what we need to do is actually turn this up to 100% in order for Vital to actually take into account the velocity information that is sent through to it from the MIDI track. So when I'm in the MIDI, you can hear that these notes that are like slightly quieter or have a lower velocity when I press it, and then the higher ones. So you can hear there's a difference in volume between them. We use this to sort of add emotion throughout the track, but we're going to get to that in much more detail when we start looking at the actual melody itself. All right, so last thing in Vital is I just want to add a few effects to this patch just to really sort of finish it off. So the first thing I want to add is a compressor. So we just come over, activate that. The compressor comes with a few different settings. You've got multi-band, single band, high band, and low band. We actually want to keep it on multi-band. Multi-band is one of the sort of best settings. I'm just going to play that. You can hear that already. It's actually like nicely changing the pad. It's bringing out that sort of like a high frequency sort of grit to it. I don't want to go into all of the multi-band settings sort of this early on in the tutorial, so I'm just going to go through and just sort of tweak it so it's right for this instrument. So that's with it bypassed. And you can hear it just it kind of adds almost like a bit of excitation to the high end. So that's fine. Don't need to go into any more details of it there. Now I want to add a bit of distortion. So for this, we will keep it on its stock setting of soft clip, which is kind of more like, or at least if you use it in a sort of not too strong way, it's more like saturation than like distortion. But there's kind of like a fine line between either, so that's fine. Let's just have a little listen. And again, it's really just adding just a little bit of sort of sparkle or grit, if you like, to the high end of the sound. And then EQ, we're going to add. So there's a few different settings that you can use in here. If you click on the low, for example, you can cycle through between either a low cut or a low shelf. So we're going to have it on a low shelf. We're going to give it a little bit of a boost, I think. And also with the high end, you can have it as a high cut or a high shelf. So we'll just use a high shelf. And again, we're just going to boost the high end a bit. Maybe just adjust the drive a bit on the distortion just to lessen that a bit. Okay, so that sounded pretty decent. I'm happy with that. Now we can close Vital. So that's it for this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to start looking at the lead and sort of how we programmed in that entire chord progression. But in the next lesson, we will be sort of looking at the most basic part of music theory. So if you want to, if you're already like well versed in music theory, you understand it all, you can actually skip lesson 3 and go straight on to lesson 4, where we actually start building the melody itself. In lesson 3, the next lesson, we're just going to sort of look at music theory basics for those of you who don't know much about it. All right, thanks very much for watching, guys and girls. See you in the next one.